It's been over a year since Edward Snowden unveiled government secrets that would change the world. Snowden worked as a contractor for the U.S. National Security Agency, which is charged with spying on communications around the world. He had gathered thousands of secret documents on electronic surveillance and teamed up with journalist Glenn Greenwald to release them. Amanda Lang recently sat down with Greenwald. Here's the first part of their conversation.
In his book, No Place to Hide, Glenn Greenwald describes the challenge of establishing a relationship with Edward Snowden. It was Snowden who first contacted Greenwald, but he refused to discuss details until Greenwald started encrypting his communications, a process that took months. Since being entrusted with Snowden's documents, Greenwald has distributed selected files to media partners around the world. Most of those documents remain secret, though, and could stay that way for a long time. When we sat down recently, I asked Greenwald about the most shocking things he saw in the Snowden files.
The two most shocking aspects are, number one, that the goal of the NSA and its partners is literally to collect it all, to make certain that there is no form of electronic human communication that exists outside of their scope, which is really another way of saying that their goal is the complete elimination of privacy in the digital age. That's not hyperbole, it's not dramatic license, it is an explicit, literal description of what their institutional aspiration is. And the other most shocking part is how close they are to achieving that objective. It is extraordinary that the NSA, just the NSA by itself, collects every single day data on billions with a B, of telephone calls and email communications and chats. So much so that their biggest problem is an inability to store it all. They are literally trying to collect the entire internet and make it available to them to monitor, search, and analyze at will.
How are they doing with that?
They're doing quite well with that, unfortunately. And I should add that it's not the stated mission only of the U.S., but of the entire Five Eyes Alliance, which of course includes the UK, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, which have this as their goal collectively. And that is, I think, what prompted Edward Snowden to come forward, was not just that they had this aspiration, but that they were very close to fulfilling it.
If the U.S. and its intelligence allies were close to fulfilling their goal of total electronic surveillance, Edward Snowden's leaks may have challenged those plans. Still, Glenn Greenwald and his partners were left with the challenge of distributing all that secret information and deciding whether some of it should ever be released at all.
When Edward Snowden came to us, he had a very clear idea of how he thought this material should be reported. If he thought that he wanted it all to be simply uploaded to the internet, he never would have needed to come to journalists. He easily could have done that himself. In fact, he has more of a capability of publishing tens of thousands of documents on the internet than I do or other journalists do. That was clearly something he didn't want. In fact, he was adamant that a lot of the material he was giving to us was information that probably shouldn't be disclosed because it could put lives in danger, because the public interest in knowing it is actually quite minimal. And what he asked us to do, the challenge that he asked us to undertake, was to very carefully evaluate every document to see whether or not it needed to be published in the public interest and whether it could be safely and responsibly published. We've actually been criticized for not publishing too much, for not publishing enough rather, but I think it's the role of journalists to engage in exactly that kind of balancing that journalists do every single day.
Does that feel like a big responsibility, though, to you, to decide what should and should not be published?
Sure, it's a huge responsibility, and there was a lot of burden and a lot of stress. Obviously we've been criticized for publishing too much, for being reckless, for helping the terrorists. I consider that criticism to be almost completely invalid. That doesn't bother me in the slightest. The criticism that keeps me up more at night is the criticism that we haven't published enough, that we've been too careful in the dissemination of information. And it has been a very difficult balancing act at all times, and the responsibilities that you have to your source, to the public, to people whose lives might be in danger, as a result of the reporting that you're doing is very substantial, and we take it really seriously.
You could see as a journalist why this information was riveting, appealing, life-changing. But your life must be difficult, given what you know about how authorities behave. Are you worried at all about yourself and your safety and what is no longer private for you?
Sure. I think once I understood what the magnitude of this archive actually was, not just the number of documents, but the sensitivity of it, I knew that there was going to be all kinds of risks and all kinds of dangers that would be attendant to the reporting. I took reasonable precautions to safeguard against them, and then just decided that I was going to put that aside and not focus on that, because that can lead to paranoia and paralysis, but I think journalists all over the world, including ones who work in total obscurity, if you challenge powerful factions, whether it be your local police department or the world's most powerful government, the nature of their power is that they're going to try and do things against you. Journalism, when done right, is inherently risky, and lots of journalists face far worse than I have. I think the visibility of this case globally has served as a protection, and so yeah, there have been difficulties, but I think that's just inherent to being a journalist.
The reporting that grew out of Snowden's leaks caused controversy in the United States.
Hey, hey, ho, ho.
That anger was shared around the world. German media reported that the U.S. had tapped the phone of Chancellor Angela Merkel, causing a major diplomatic incident. For Glenn Greenwald, international controversy is just part of the job.
Well, first of all kinds of reporting causes diplomatic strain between countries. When it was reported that the U.S. was rendering people around the world to countries that engage in torture, that caused all kinds of embarrassment for those countries. For the U.S., it caused diplomatic strain between the U.S. and its European partners. It isn't the job of a journalist to protect the U.S. government. If the U.S. government doesn't want the embarrassment of what it's doing, then it shouldn't be doing it, is how I view it. But I think that there is a real debate. I mean, most people do think that their government should be spying on adversarial countries. So I don't think anybody thinks it's questionable that the U.S. is spying on China or Iran or Russia. But the idea that we will be spying on democratically elected leaders of allied governments, such as Chancellor Merkel in Germany or President Rousseff in Brazil, is obviously something that's been very controversial. And as a journalist, my job is to inform the public debate and let those debates take place, not to suppress them or hide them out of a desire to protect the U.S. government.
Well, in fact, in the case of Canada, it appears that we were spying in Brazil, perhaps not for international relations reasons at all, perhaps for business interests. How much of that is in these files? How much of it isn't about terrorism at all?
That's a critical point to me, because the government has been claiming since the reporting began that this spying is necessary to protect people from terrorist attacks, and essentially engaging in a fear-mongering campaign to try and make people think that if they don't acquiesce to the spying, that their lives will be in danger or the lives of their children will be. And yet the overwhelming bulk of the spying that is done has no remote relationship to national security or to terrorism. It has to do with putting entire populations under a microscope for diplomatic advantage, or in the case, as you said, of CSEC spying on the Ministry of Mines and Energy in Brazil, which just happens to be the agency of greatest interest to the Canadian logging industry, clearly spying that's done for unfair economic advantage, and that's a lot of the spying that is done are for those reasons.
If we could isolate the surveillance that's done just related to terrorism, is that justifiable? If there was a way to say, okay, these agencies engaged in these activities with citizen permission, which was missing in this case, would that be okay?
I don't think that just because something is being done in the name of stopping terrorism, it makes it justifiable. That's the argument that the United States government used, for instance, to imprison people for over a decade at Guantanamo with no trials, or to torture people around the world, that it was necessary to do in defense of security against terrorists. So I don't think that it's necessarily justified. But I do think that everyone in this debate agrees that there's a role to play for state surveillance. The difference is between mass surveillance and targeted surveillance. So if the government is targeting their surveillance at people whom they've convinced a court are engaged in dangerous or threatening behavior and are specifically focused on the communications of those individuals, I think very few people around the world would have a problem with it, and there wouldn't have been an Edward Snowden. It's because there's mass indiscriminate surveillance that's taking place that there is an Edward Snowden and there is a debate.
Coming up, the complicated relationship between Silicon Valley giants and the surveillance state. That's just ahead in part 2 of Amanda Lang's interview with Glenn Greenwald. The classified documents leaked by Edward Snowden showed the world that the digital realm isn't as private as we thought. That's had a ripple effect throughout the digital economy. Here's the second part of Amanda's conversation with Glenn Greenwald, the journalist who helped Snowden leak those secret files.
The scope of government surveillance revealed in the Snowden leaks proved to be a big problem for the companies that manage our data. After the leaks, a number of U.S. technology firms wrote to President Obama and Congress seeking stricter controls on electronic spying. In our recent conversation, Glenn Greenwald and I talked about the relationship between the private sector and state surveillance.
Is part of the answer to this going to lie with the technology companies that actually helped facilitate the surveillance in the first place? Are they now stepping up and saying, we don't actually want to be part of this, and then maybe able to create technology that won't allow it?
I think that's absolutely one of the most important pressure points in how this spying will be curbed. These technology companies, Facebook, Google, Yahoo, Skype, were more than happy to turn over all of their customer data to cooperate in every way with the government when they thought that there was no cost to doing so because it was being done in secret and nobody would ever know. Subsequent to the Snowden revelations, there is now a huge cost for them doing that, namely that they're petrified that the next generation of users will be vulnerable to an appeal by Korean or German or Brazilian companies that says, don't use Facebook or Google, use our companies because we won't give your data to the government. And this has created a very strong incentive on the part of these technology companies to prove to the public that they will not collaborate with the NSA and that they will protect people's privacy through encryption products and the like. And they're now doing that, and it's creating real problems for the surveillance state.
Do you believe that we can stay ahead of the surveillance? Will they always be able to find a way, various state governments, to find a way to watch us?
It's essentially like an arms race between private citizens around the world that want their privacy preserved and want to be able to communicate with each other on the internet without prying eyes being cast upon them, and these governments and corporations that want to turn the internet into a realm of mass surveillance as a means of turning it into a realm of mass control. And I think the crucial front in this arms race is the ability of privacy advocates and technologists to create products that let people protect their privacy as the government tries continuously to undermine and subvert it. And one of the most important parts of the Snowden revelations was that it enabled people who care about privacy to understand how privacy is being compromised so that they can guard against it.
How do you feel about people who think Edward Snowden is a traitor?
The claim that he's a traitor is something that has been made about virtually every single person who has revealed things that the U.S. government didn't want revealed about what it was that it was doing, going all the way back to Daniel Ellsberg, who showed the American people that their government was systematically lying to them about the Vietnam War. Daniel Ellsberg is regarded as a hero today, but at the time he was widely called a traitor. Ultimately, the question is, should your loyalty be to your country and the principles and the political rights it guarantees, or to the government? And sometimes the government acts in betrayal of its citizenry and of the political rights that it guarantees. And I think a citizen's obligation is to act to protect the rights of their fellow citizens, not to serve the government. That's patriotism, not treason.
In your view, what is the best outcome here? What would you like to have happen at the end of all of this?
I think that there needs to be an end to mass surveillance. I don't think governments ever can legitimately put people indiscriminately who have done nothing wrong under microscopes and collect information about what entire populations are doing. And the way that that can happen is other countries around the world can band together to take steps to prevent U.S. hegemony over the internet. I think tech companies, as we discussed, will play a major role in pressuring these companies to not do that because they're worried about their profit. And then the most important outcome, I think, is for individuals to value their own privacy and to take steps like using encryption and other kinds of readily available products that will only get more user-friendly and more easily obtained to protect their own privacy that really is effective in creating a wall between what they do in their lives and what governments and their ability to watch them.
I suppose technology may give us the solution to this, but the idea that governments will now step back from this kind of surveillance seems optimistic at best. Is there a middle ground that you'd settle for?
I mean, I think that there is an inherent danger and an inherent evil from having authorities be able to collect and monitor information about people who have done nothing wrong. And there's so many historical examples that demonstrate how dangerous that is. So as long as mass surveillance is continuing, I think this danger will be very pronounced. But I do believe that individuals have the ability, working through their own governments, working through their market choices to not use companies that don't demonstrate a commitment to their own privacy, and taking matters into their own hands to just make it difficult, if not impossible, for these governments to continue to spy on the internet, even though they may want to every bit as much as they do now.
If we live in a world where we have to, at some level, understand we don't have privacy, how does that change us?
It radically changes everything that we do. There are all kinds of psychological studies that demonstrate that when we think we're being watched, we make much different choices than when we realize we're alone. We make choices that are much more compliant and conformist, the ones that we think are in accordance with the expectations that others have of us. A surveillance state is one that breeds conformity and submission and obedience, which is why all tyrannical rulers love a surveillance state. Privacy is a critical realm for us to be able to go to in order to think and explore and dissent freely without other people judging us or punishing us for what it is that we're doing. So it changes the society collectively and politically, but it really radically changes what individual freedom is when we have no realm of privacy left.
All right, we'll leave it there. We appreciate your time.
Thanks very much. Appreciate it.